Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the 1840s and 1850s, to the dusty hills of California, where fortunes were supposedly just lying around in the rivers waiting for you to scoop them up. So go ahead, make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, pull the blanket up to your chin, and let's take a nice, slow journey into one of the least relaxing places in history. Because tonight, we're going to spend a very long, uncomfortable day in a gold rush camp. Now, the gold rush always sounds glamorous when you first hear about it. There's gold in the river. After all, you just grab a pan, swirl some muddy water, and boom, you're rich. At least, that's the fantasy that sent hundreds of thousands of people rushing to California in 1849, which is why they were called the 49ers. They weren't football players. They were just ordinary people with ordinary jobs like blacksmiths, bakers, and unlucky bookkeepers who thought they'd strike it rich overnight. And naturally, almost none of them did, because that's how these things usually go. Let's set the scene. You've traveled for months just to get here. If you came by sea, you probably spent 5 or 6 months on a cramped, foul-smelling ship going around Cape Horn, which is known for sinking boats like a bored child knocking over toy blocks. If you came overland, you crossed the desert, the Rockies, and probably buried at least one wagon wheel and possibly a relative along the way. By the time you arrive, you look like you've been dragged backwards through a cactus patch. But you made it. You're here. And what greets you? A gold camp, which, in the most generous description possible, was a pile of tents, some hastily thrown together wooden shacks, a couple of very busy saloons, and mud everywhere. Actual mud, actual filth, and the sort of smell that suggests several hundred men have not bathed in several weeks because they hadn't. There are no proper roads yet, no real sanitation, just people, dirt, and the distant sound of someone arguing over a claim. You set up your tent, which is your new home. If you don't have a tent, you sleep under your wagon or maybe in a hastily dug hole with some branches over it. This is technically considered shelter. The first thing you notice is that gold prospecting is not. In fact, just lounging by a river until you see a shiny nugget floating past. You'll be standing in icy water for hours, hunched over, swirling mud in a pan, and maybe, if you're lucky, finding a few flakes of gold that might add up to enough money to buy a stale loaf of bread. And that bread, it might cost you $20. In today's money, that would be about $600 for one sad little loaf. And no, you can't just go buy another one. Food is expensive because it has to be brought in from somewhere else, and there aren't many somewhere else's nearby. If you want cheaper food, you grow it yourself, but of course you can't because the soil here is mostly gravel and frustration. So you do what everyone else does. You live on beans, bacon, and coffee every day, 3 times a day, until you start dreaming about vegetables like they're long-lost lovers. Some miners even got scurvy, which is what happens when your body is so starved of vitamin C that your gums start bleeding and your teeth try to escape. And this is only day 1. Your neighbors in camp are a colorful bunch. By colorful, I mean loud, desperate, and occasionally violent. Because here's the thing about the gold rush. Everyone is broke, tired, and convinced that the person next to them is secretly striking it rich. So, naturally, tempers flare. Fights break out over who staked a claim first, or who accidentally sneezed too close to someone else's pan. The justice system? Well, that's whoever has the most friends in camp. Miners' courts were a thing where everyone just sort of stood around and voted on who was guilty. If you were guilty, the punishment ranged from a fine you couldn't afford to being told to get out of camp, which meant you were now broke and homeless in the middle of nowhere. At night, when you try to sleep, you can hear the distant racket from a saloon. There's always a saloon. Men drinking, shouting, occasionally shooting their pistols into the air because nothing says relaxing evening like a bit of random gunfire. And yes, sometimes bandits showed up, too. The gold camps were a favorite target for thieves because everyone carried whatever gold they found in their pockets, which is a little like putting up a sign that says, "Please rob me." By now, you might be thinking, well, at least there was gold. Surely somebody got rich. And yes, someone did. Usually, it was the person selling you your shovel. Merchants made fortunes selling equipment, food, and clothing to desperate miners. The miners themselves? Most went home with less money than they started with. Many didn't even make it home at all. But let's not get too gloomy. There were bright moments, too. Miners held dances, sang songs, and created their own rough little societies out in the wilderness. There's something strangely endearing about the human ability to build a community out of nothing but tents and dust. And who knows, you might even find a nugget big enough to buy yourself a nice hot bath, assuming anyone in camp has enough water to spare. So, if you were imagining the gold rush as a relaxing getaway full of easy riches, think again. It was backbreaking, freezing, uncomfortable work, with a side order of hunger, danger, and a constant faint smell of unwashed socks. But that's what makes it so fascinating, right? And as we settle deeper into the story, let's drift onward from the muddy rivers and into the strange little towns that grew up around them. Because once the first nuggets were found, the gold rush didn't just create camps. It created entire cities almost overnight. And naturally, they were complete disasters at first. What would you have done arriving in a camp like this? Tried your luck in a river? Open a shop? Or just turn around and gone home? Let me know down in the comments. After all, it's easy to survive the gold rush from the safety of your pillow. So, we survived our first grim, muddy day in camp. You're wet, you're hungry, and you smell faintly like a neglected horse blanket. But now we're heading somewhere new, the gold rush boom towns. These weren't towns in the cozy sense, with quaint little bakeries and polite neighbors. No, these were rough, thrown together, chaotic collections of wood, canvas, and ambition. Imagine a town that popped up in a matter of weeks, because someone struck gold nearby. At first, it's just a few tents. Then someone builds a shack, because naturally, no one wants to live in a tent forever. Then someone else builds a saloon, because apparently humanity cannot go more than a few days without alcohol. Before you know it, there's a gambling hall, a boarding house, and a few enterprising individuals opening restaurants, which often consisted of one stove, one menu item, and a cook who may or may not know what cooking actually is. And because these towns appeared faster than you can say supply chain problem, there was very little in the way of actual planning. Streets? Only if you count the muddy gaps between the tents. Sewers? No. Sidewalks? Don't make me laugh. The whole town was basically a chaotic experiment in how quickly a group of strangers could build a functioning society, or more often, a dysfunctional one. Crime was a natural part of the equation. After all, you have a lot of tired, cranky miners carrying around whatever gold they'd found, and you have a town with no real law enforcement. You can guess what happened next. Theft was common. So was gambling. So was the occasional brawl that spilled out of a saloon and into the street, usually because someone accused someone else of cheating at cards. Eventually, there would be some attempt at law and order. Sometimes this meant hiring a sheriff, who was usually either very brave or very reckless, because keeping order in a gold rush town was a bit like trying to referee a fistfight between 20 drunk bears. In many cases, the sheriff's main job was to organize a posse after a robbery and try to track down the thief before he left town. And then there were the vigilantes, because when the official law couldn't keep up, and it usually couldn't, the miners would form committees. They would hold public meetings, declare someone guilty, and hand out justice on the spot. This could range from running someone out of town to more permanent solutions, like a quick hanging in the nearest convenient tree. Justice in gold rush towns was not exactly gentle, but it wasn't all violence and chaos. There was a strange kind of energy in these towns. They were full of possibility. Anyone could reinvent themselves. You could arrive as a failed hat maker from Boston and decide that, starting today, you were a blacksmith, or a gambler, or a saloon keeper. The social rules were loose, and nobody cared much about who you'd been before you showed up. It was equal parts terrifying and liberating. And let's talk about the economy. Prices were creative. We already mentioned that bread could cost you a small fortune in the camps, but in town it wasn't much better. Eggs, if you could find them, could be $1 each. Boots might cost more than you made in a week. And if you needed something specialized, like a decent doctor, well, good luck. Most doctors in gold rush towns were self-taught, which is a polite way of saying they were just guessing. If you broke your leg, they might set it properly. Or They might just remove the leg. Housing was another adventure. You might rent a bed in a boarding house, but bed is a generous term. You were likely sharing a single mattress with 2 or 3 other men, and if one of them had lice, well, congratulations, so do you now. Privacy was non-existent. People slept in shifts so that as soon as one person got out to go work, someone else took their spot. But there was entertainment. Because apparently even in the most chaotic places on Earth, humans still find time to have fun. Saloons were the main social hubs, with gambling tables, cheap whiskey, and the occasional pianist banging out tunes on a piano that had somehow survived the journey west. There were also traveling performers, preachers, and con men who made their living by keeping the restless miners occupied or scamming them out of what little gold they had. And because this is bedtime history, let's not get too excited. The truth is, gold rush towns were exhausting places to live. They were noisy, dirty, and never truly felt safe. But they were also full of strange little moments that tell us a lot about human nature. People opened newspapers. They formed debating societies. They started schools. In the middle of all the dust and greed, they still wanted some sense of normalcy. If you were there, what would you have done? Would you try to keep your head down and quietly mine, hoping to get just enough gold to go home? Or would you stay and gamble it all on a new life, risking everything in the process? Tell me in the comments what your gold rush alter ego would be. Now, let's drift onward to the next chapter of the saga, the people themselves. Not just the miners and merchants, but the fascinating characters who came to California seeking adventure. Because the gold rush didn't just attract your average farmer or laborer. It drew some of the most eccentric, stubborn, and downright unlucky people in the 19th century. So now we wandered into town and found a spot in a crowded boarding house. It smells faintly of tobacco, whiskey, and wet socks, but at least it's not raining on you anymore. And now, as you sip your overpriced coffee, you start to notice the people around you and what a group they are. The gold rush attracted every sort of person you can imagine. Farmers, blacksmiths, runaway apprentices, sailors who got off their ships and never went back. It also attracted a fair number of people who really had no business being there at all. Scholars, lawyers, former aristocrats who had lost their fortunes and were now hacking a riverbank with the rest of the crowd. One of the remarkable things about the gold rush was how global it was. People came from all over the world: Mexico, Chile, China, Australia, Europe. You might hear 5 or 6 languages in a single street. It gave the camps a strange cosmopolitan feel, like a meeting point at the edge of the earth. Of course, this didn't always lead to harmony. The rush for gold often turned into a rush for scapegoats, and immigrants were sometimes driven out of camps or taxed unfairly by locals who thought they were taking all the gold. As if there was ever enough gold for everyone. There were also the professional gamblers. These were the people who realized very quickly that the easiest way to get someone's gold was not to mine it yourself, but to win it off them in a game of cards. Some of them were genuinely skilled. Others were just skilled at cheating. Either way, they were part of the lifeblood of the town. And if you lost your week's wages at their table, well, you should have played better. And then there were the con artists. If there is one universal truth about human history, it's that wherever there are desperate people, someone is nearby selling them a miracle cure. In gold rush towns, this meant miracle gold-finding machines, basically boxes with spinning wheels that supposedly separated gold from dirt. Spoiler, they didn't. People sold guaranteed rich claims, which were usually just empty patches of dirt that had been salted with a few gold flakes to look promising. And there were always fake doctors, fake lawyers, and fake priests ready to offer you services you didn't need. Still, among the chaos, there were genuinely fascinating people. Some of the earliest female entrepreneurs in the West made their fortunes here, running boarding houses, selling food, even running laundries, which was surprisingly profitable because miners hated doing laundry more than they hated losing money. In fact, if you want to strike it rich, your best bet wasn't mining at all. It was washing other people's socks. And then there were the characters who were just odd. People who walked around camp wearing outlandish outfits, or men who insisted they were secretly European nobility or self-proclaimed experts, who spent more time giving loud advice than actually working. You'd have seen it all. But through it all, There was a sense of strange camaraderie. Everyone was here for the same reason, the dream of gold. And that dream kept them going through hunger, illness, and the occasional gunfight outside the saloon window. As you drift off under your thin blanket at night, you might wonder, would you have been a quiet type, keeping to yourself, or would you have been one of these colorful characters, making friends and enemies everywhere you went? Let me know what role you think you'd have played in a town like this. And as we move gently onward, let's leave the town behind for a moment and step out into the wilderness. Because the gold rush wasn't just about the camps and the cities. It was about the land itself. Rugged, wild, and unforgiving, California in the 1850s was not exactly a welcoming place. The California landscape looks romantic in paintings. Rolling hills, glistening rivers, majestic mountains. But when you're actually living in it, day after day, it's less romantic and more constantly trying to kill you. The weather could be brutal. Hot, dusty summers baked the camps until everyone was coated in a fine layer of dirt, while winters could be cold and wet enough to turn the camps into swamps. You could easily get sick just from standing in icy water all day panning for gold. Pneumonia was common. So were fevers of mysterious origin that no one really knew how to treat. And speaking of sickness, the camps were basically petri dishes for every disease you can name. Dysentery was practically a rite of passage. Cholera made regular visits. If you didn't boil your water, you'd probably regret it. If you did boil your water, you might still regret it, because the water source was often just a few feet downstream from where someone else was dumping their waste. The work itself was exhausting. Swinging a pickaxe for 12 hours a day, or shoveling dirt into a sluice box until your arms feel like lead, was not exactly easy on the body. And because miners were paid only what they found, every day felt like a gamble. You might work for a week and find nothing, or you might find a single nugget that made it all feel worthwhile. Wildlife was another hazard. Bears occasionally wandered into camps looking for food, and mountain lions were not unheard of. There were also snakes, including rattlesnakes, which had a charming habit of lurking exactly where you wanted to put your hand. And if that wasn't enough, there were the mosquitoes, endless, hungry mosquitoes that made sleeping almost impossible. The isolation could wear on people, too. Many miners wrote letters home, describing crushing loneliness. There were few women in the early years, and social life could be limited to shouting across a muddy creek at your neighbor. Some miners simply packed up and left, deciding that no amount of gold was worth another miserable season. But for those who stayed, the land was both enemy and partner. It was unforgiving, but it held the promise of reward. That balance, the constant hope that tomorrow might be the lucky day, kept people digging, even when their hands were blistered and their boots were falling apart. What about you? Do you think you'd have lasted through that kind of grind, day after day, hoping for a big strike? Or would you have taken your chances, sold your gear, and gone back east? Tell me in the comments what your breaking point would have been. And now, let's drift forward into the heart of the story, the gold itself, the shining metal that caused all this chaos. Because for all the hardship, the hunger, and the danger, there was always that one gleam of possibility waiting in the bottom of a pan. Gold has a strange effect on people. It's shiny, rare, and basically useless for anything except looking pretty and making coins. And yet, somehow, it drives entire populations halfway across the world. California's rivers held just enough gold to keep hope alive, but not nearly enough to make everyone rich. And that was the point. When you finally spot that first tiny flake glittering in the bottom of your pan, your heart skips. It's ridiculous, really. It's smaller than a crumb, but it's gold and it's yours, and suddenly you're thinking, maybe tomorrow I'll find a bigger one. That hope is addictive. It's what kept miners wading back into freezing rivers day after day until their legs went numb. But gold also brought out the worst in people. Claim jumping. Sneaking onto someone else's land to take their gold was common. So were disputes over where one claim ended and another began. Maps were vague, boundaries unclear, and tempers quick. A miner might wake up one morning and find that his claim had been restaked by someone else overnight, which often led to loud arguments or worse. Gold dust was the main currency of the camps, which was a problem because gold dust is very easy to spill, lose, or accidentally blow away. Merchants kept little scales to weigh out the right amount for goods, and some helpfully made those scales just slightly inaccurate. Always in their favor, of course. And yet, despite all of this, there were success stories. A lucky few really did strike it rich. Someone would dig into the side of a hill and find a pocket of gold so large that they could retire on the spot. Naturally, stories of these lucky finds spread like wildfire and kept everyone else working even harder, convinced that their turn was coming. Would you have been one of those determined types, clinging to hope no matter how small the flakes in your pan? Or would you have given up after a week and decided this was just not worth it? Let's drift onward from the glittering riverbeds to another part of gold rush life, the boom and bust economy that came with it. Because when thousands of people show up somewhere overnight, the money doesn't just flow into gold pans. It starts sloshing around in every direction. If there's one thing the gold rush did well, it was inflating prices beyond all reason. As soon as a town appeared, so did merchants, hauling wagons full of supplies and charging whatever they wanted. A shovel that might cost $2 back east could fetch $50 here. Boots could cost more than a good horse. And people paid, because what choice did they have? It was a classic case of supply and demand. Except here, the demand was desperate, and the supply was whatever someone had managed to drag over mountains or ship around Cape Horn. Some clever merchants didn't even bother mining. They simply sold mining equipment and watched the money roll in. Levi Strauss famously made a fortune not by digging for gold, but by selling durable pans to the miners. The gambling halls made money. The saloons made money. The blacksmith, the boarding house owner, even the guy who ran the local outhouse made money. The miners themselves? Not so much. Many went home broke. But the infrastructure of California, its roads, its cities, was paid for by the flood of cash that passed through these places. Of course, the boom never lasted forever. As soon as the gold in one area ran out, the town would wither. Buildings would be abandoned, saloons boarded up, and within a year the place might be a ghost town, left to gather dust until some future tourists wandered through. What would you have done? Tried to ride the wave while it lasted? Or quietly slipped away before the inevitable bust? As we settle deeper into the night, let's drift on to another group of people who don't get talked about enough. The women of the gold rush. Women were rare in the early camps. In 1850, there were nearly 20 men for every woman in California. This imbalance shaped the entire culture. Women who did come west had opportunities they never would have had back east. They ran businesses, owned property, and made money in ways society often denied them elsewhere. Some became legendary figures. There were women who opened boarding houses that became the social centers of entire towns. Others ran successful laundries, bakeries, or even saloons. A few took up mining themselves, though this was harder simply because of the physical demands. There were also women who worked in less glamorous professions, dance hall girls, entertainers, and those who sold companionship for gold dust. Life was not easy for them either, but they were part of the fabric of the camps. And of course, there were families, women who became husbands, raising children in the middle of this chaos. Imagine trying to teach a toddler to walk in a muddy mining camp, or try and keep them from falling into a sluice box. Somehow they managed. Would you have come west if you were a woman in the 1850s? Would you have braved the journey, knowing the risks for the chance at independence? Let's gently move on now into the darker corners of the gold rush, crime, punishment, and the many ways things could go wrong. Gold rush towns were magnets for crime. Theft was common, robbery was frequent, and murder was not unheard of. With no established police force, the miners had to create their own justice system. Sometimes this worked surprisingly well. Miners' courts could be quick and efficient, with juries of fellow miners handing down verdicts in a matter of hours. Other times, it was pure chaos. Accusations flew, tempers flared, and the court turned into a shouting match. Vigilante groups also took matters into their own hands. If someone was caught stealing repeatedly, the camp might hold a meeting and decide that the thief should be whipped or branded or simply run out of town. In some cases, hangings were carried out without much of a trial at all. It was rough justice, but in a world where formal law barely existed, it was what kept some semblance of order. How would you have handled justice if you were there? Would you have trusted the miners' courts, or would you have stayed far away and hoped to avoid trouble entirely? And now, let's move forward into the quieter side of gold rush life. The small comforts, the moments of humanity that made the harshness bearable. For all its hardships, life in the camps wasn't entirely miserable. People found ways to make it tolerable. They held dances, sang around campfires, told stories. Some miners even brought books west and formed tiny lending libraries. Music was popular. Fiddles, banjos, and guitars could be heard in the evenings. So could laughter, often fueled by cheap whiskey. And when holidays came around, miners did their best to celebrate. Christmas dinners might consist of beans and bacon, but they were eaten with a sense of occasion. These moments mattered. They reminded the miners that they were still human, not just gold-digging machines. Would you have joined in those campfire gatherings, or stayed in your tent, too tired to socialize? Let's drift forward now to the decline, because every gold rush has to end. By the late 1850s, most of the easy gold was gone. The days of panning nuggets out of riverbeds were over. Mining became industrial, with big companies using heavy equipment to dig deep into the earth. This pushed out many individual miners who couldn't compete. Some stayed, finding other work or settling down as farmers or shopkeepers. Others left California entirely, heading to the next gold strike in Colorado or Nevada. The era of the wild, chaotic camps faded, leaving behind towns, roads, and a much larger population than before. California itself was transformed. It went from a remote, sparsely populated region to a booming state almost overnight. The gold rush was short, but it left a permanent mark. Would you have stayed, try and build a life in this new California, or would you have packed up and chased the next big thing? Let's move gently into the aftermath, the ghost towns and the memories left behind. Today, many gold rush towns are empty. Wooden buildings stand silent, their roofs sagging, their windows staring blankly at the hills. Walking through them feels like stepping into a paused moment in history. You can still see the old saloons, the crumbling boarding houses, even the rusted mining equipment left where it last stood. It's a strangely peaceful sight, a reminder that all that noise, all that striving, eventually faded away. But the human stories remain. Diaries, letters, and newspaper articles from the time still tell us what life was like. They tell of hope, of heartbreak, of triumphs and disasters. Would you visit a ghost town if you had the chance? What would you feel, standing where so many people once staked their dreams? And now, let's bring this journey to a soft, sleepy close. We spent a long night wandering to the gold rush. From muddy camps to bustling towns, from shimmering rivers to silent ghost towns. It was hard, dirty, and dangerous, but it was also full of life, of strange characters, and the endless human urge to try, to dig, to hope. As you lie back now, think about what we've seen. The prospectors, the gamblers, the saloon keepers, the women who built businesses, the men who staked everything on a single claim. Think about the sound of the river, the clink of gold dust in a tin, the creak of a saloon door at midnight, and then let it all fade away. The gold rush is long over. The camps are quiet. The saloons are empty. The hills are still. Thank you for joining me tonight on this long, slow journey. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video, subscribing for more sleepy history, and sharing it with someone who needs a little peace. And before you drift off completely, tell me in the comments, would you have survived a gold rush camp? Or would you have been on the first wagon heading back east? Good night and sleep well.